Hello everyone, I'm Cristina Cafara and this is Escape Forward, the place where I have the pleasure of discussing with some of my favorite people the most interesting and salient issues, in my view, in policy today, mostly outside the field of antitrust that was my original domain. Today's episode is motivated by something I feel extremely strongly about, how Europe, which was once a pioneer and a trailblazer in all things tech, has become in some sense a vassal. Some call it a digital colony, where the bulk of our core digital infrastructure, and not just apps and services, is increasingly dependent on a handful of extraterritorial technology providers, from chips and, of course, rare minerals, to cloud, to software, to connectivity. So we in Europe have amazing talent, innovation, economic power, and yet we have somewhat rolled back while non-European companies have rolled forward with services and infrastructure, seemingly without obstacles across the entire continent. And now we are faced with a new geoeconomics reality of hard power, where we have dependencies that are obviously harmful, because what we thought was the benign attitude of our protector and partner, the United States, has changed. So we see the Trump administration clearly wielding resentment towards Europe for not burden sharing enough as a weapon to subdue, coerce Europe in multiple dimensions. But there's also at the same time, and very much linked to that, a resurgence of pro-European pride, perhaps a major desire of emancipation from somewhat our dependencies. Eurostack, which I'm associated with, is a prominent pan-European movement. It's grown out and aware at great speed, but it's not the only voice. There is a big drive for digital sovereignty, which is broad and growing. And indeed, part of the motivation for this discussion is that the German government and the French government will hold imminently a summit in Berlin on European digital sovereignty, recognizing precisely that this is something under growing pressure. So I'm delighted to host for this conversation two real leading figures in this discussion, both thought leaders and amazing doers. So starting from Dietmar Harhoff, he had, of course, a hugely varied, distinguished academic career in all sorts of innovation-related field, research, management, entrepreneurship, strategic management, intellectual property. We go back a long way. Managing director at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition and director of the Center for Innovation Entrepreneurship Research. Then Rafael Laguna de la Vera is also someone I'm delighted to have here. He is best known and very well known as the founding director of the Federal Agency for Disruptive Innovation, SPRINT, in Germany, which is a model agency for investment in innovative projects with enormous influence at policy level, but actually doing. And he has a background as a serial entrepreneur, visiting professors at several universities, and so on. So these are the people, I think, who are best to take us through what I think is a broad discussion of, well, where we are, how we got here in some way, and where is it all going in this discussion on sovereignty. Good day, both of you. Again, delighted to have you here. I want to start with the status quo, an assessment of where we are. So I mentioned the dependencies that are very much in the public debate that Europe suffers from. Let us talk about these dependencies. Where are the real pain points? Where are these dependencies located? And I'm interested in some sort of panoramic of the whole stack. We go, of course, from minerals to chip to AI via cloud and software and connectivity. So what are these dependencies? What are the pain points? What can go wrong? We had recent outages, which of course have been in the news, AWS, Microsoft. There is a big discussion around what some governments are thinking of doing to replace some of these dependencies. But let me pause here and start with you, Rafael, and then we'll move on to Dietmar. Do you want to give us a view on where you think we are in this predicament at this point. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christina, for having us. Obviously, we're dependent on all levels of the stack, from raw materials all the way up through the stack to AI, and with everything in between, you can layer this. We layer this in 7 layers. If you go from minerals to chips, to the infrastructure software, application software, infrastructure for AI, GPUs, and then the application of AI all the way to the top. I guess we all know the names whom we're depending on. China with the raw materials, Taiwan mainly with the chip manufacturing of leading node sizes. We can do trailing node sizes, but we can't do leading node sizes. But even in trailing electronics, we can see the dependencies from China just now in the automotive industry with what's going on in Holland. So next level up, infrastructure, although open source is delivering most of that software stack, the operations and turning this into services that people want is what the hyperscalers do, and they do it very well at scale and also with broad services that they're offering. Although we do have cloud hosting in Europe, we all know it's not as at scale, it's not as broad. So where the hyperscalers are more the IKEA and Boeing at the same time, or Airbus in terms of size and quality, but also in terms of scope of the services they offer, we have mom and pop shops in a way when we compare it to them. Software is not the issue. We all know very bright European people are developing the software, are working at these companies. So it's not a skill thing. We do have the skills in European people, but they work elsewhere, and that's the issue. Then if you go further up, applications, we're all depending on Microsoft Office. I don't know why still, but that's the fact. We're depending on all these messengers. I don't know why still, because there's lots of alternatives. But of course, the big guys have the network effects. So it's very hard to move away from these huge platforms because everybody else is there. So even when we're upset and we're moving away, we're coming back because we're being dragged into the network. Again, if you go further up, let's say AI applications, we see the large language models. It's still a fight between open source models and closed models. I mean, the most closed one called OpenAI. It's kind of funny in a way. It was intended in a different way. But we see a battle between, China as a country with DeepSeek open source models. We see that Facebook is sort of fading out. We see European attempts. We see frontier labs like Mistral and like Forest Labs in Europe that are trying to play the big boys game. We see people investing hundreds of billions to fight off the other ones. So it's a brute force war, you might say, that's going on. And then you go further up to agentic systems, which use AIs. You see edge AI and, robotics and science, AI as scientists, so to speak. That's all not settled yet. So that's sort of the battlefield of today. But if this whole stack below is not controlled by you, you're in a losing game, and we know that. We see how, and you mentioned this, how this stuff is used as political power, as negotiating power. And I think this is what it comes back to. It's not that you're ever going to be completely independent. That's never going to work. But you have to have enough components. You have to have enough negotiating power at the table to be able to negotiate. Luckily, we have a company like ASML. Without ASML, there would be not a lot of negotiating power at the chips table. This is an important company. They have a monopoly. That's very powerful. But then that's probably the only one we got in Europe when it comes to this field. So we have to work on all these layers and create enough independence on all these layers. And it's totally possible from a technological perspective. I think we just have to switch into do mode. I think we all have the realization that this is the fact. I think we do have the realization that we do have the capability in people that know things, that can do things. Now we have to do things, and that will be an orchestration between what companies are doing, because in the end, it must be companies that are doing this. But of course, we see in other countries like the US and China that the government is helping a great deal. And this is what governments need to do. Of course, we cannot wait for governments to do things. We should just start. But at the same time, to scale, we need governments, with innovative procurement. with challenges and these kinds of things. With creating the sizable capital market for the funds to be available to these companies to scale up, that needs to be orchestrated and done. And I think we're now at due time, crunch time. We need to do things.
Wonderful. And this is really a fantastic overview of the landscape. You touched on a number of points that I want to dive deeper into a little later on. But this is a great starting point. The emphasis on doing is particularly dear to my heart, as you know, because of course we took quite enough in Europe and we don't do enough. Let me go to Dietmar though, because I want to stay with this initial question about the pain points and the real risks of these dependencies. Of course, you mentioned the political risk. We are aware of where we are. We see outages as well. You know, in the last few weeks, we had the AWS, which has been very well documented. Even applications which are deeply encrypted, like Signal, was out for a while. Then there's been a Microsoft outage. There's been the Cloudflare one last year, which is always used as an indication of the way in which we have this single point of failure problem, in which can effectively drive a lot of things to fall over. Some minimize this, though. Of course, the narrative on the other side is, well, you know, things can go wrong, outages can happen. We can see the narrative that comes back. You know, 14 hours outage is not the end of the world. Still, I'd like you, Dietmar, as someone who's thought a lot about this particular point, to just expand and give us your view on what Rafael started to outline. So what exactly are the reasons why, other than, you know, pride, we want to do our thing, that we really need to be building our own infrastructure with a matter of urgency? Thank you.
So first, thanks for having me, Christina, and thanks to Rafael for this fantastic introduction and overview. And of course, he's completely right, and points to the sort of dependencies that we have. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with a subtle distinction, or apparently subtle distinction. We were just talking about pain points, and I want to contrast that with choke points. Pain points you can tolerate, you can take medication, right? You can do something about it. Choke points are life-threatening. And to me, resilience, that I think is the big term in the background, means that we have control over sufficiently many choke points to counter the impact of the choke points that other people have. And unfortunately, the balance is not very good for us. And I think that came out of Rafael's overview. Other folks have choke points, kill switches, whatever, that create a very, very strong dependency of our digital systems throughout. And Rafael pointed to ASML. ASML is for the highly advanced semiconductor manufacturing nodes, of course, a choke point, because without it, you cannot do it. So economists would talk about a Leontiev production function. You need it urgently, right? Just as the United States needs rare earth from China, because there is no production line right now. Maybe in 5 years there is one from Australia, from South America. But all of these things take time, and in the shortness of time, you are immediately dependent, and there is choking potentially. Now, that choking is, of course, all the more dangerous if it is exerted by somebody who exploits the situation. And what we have learned now is that, yes, presumed friends are also in the position now to do that in order to gain advantage over us in some other shape or form. And I think that has now finally led to a waking up. In a sort of macabre sense, we have to thank Mr. Trump for teaching us the lesson, both on the military side, that the 3% or 2% targets are to be taken seriously, but also in the digital domain, that we should not continue as we have done. And to me, this is not sort of a romantic principle. This is rationality. This is taking care of our own welfare and of the welfare of our citizens. And I'm somewhat dumbfounded by the naivete of some of my economist colleagues who still believe that the world has a perfect trading system, that the WTO is still active, and so forth and so forth and so forth. It is not. It hasn't been in the past 20 years, right? But we closed our eyes because we were so in love with our beloved theories, and trade was everywhere. So there was no strategic dependency anywhere. We have strategic dependencies. We need to take care of them. We need to move in the direction of resilience.
Wonderful. And the mention of our profession, the economist, being blissfully still progressing in many ways as if the world hadn't changed is very welcome. Let me stay with this theme because I think both of you emphasize rightly the political dimension and the risk that we are exposed to given the dependencies. What I would like to ask you, respectively, is really a view on the extent to which there is also an important component which has to do with European growth linked to this theme. We start from the Draghi report. As we know, that is something which has been widely debated in Europe. One of the key sectors that Draghi identifies as being a key cause of the difference in productivity growth between the United States and Europe is very much the digital sector. How the digital sector productivity has been very much a driver in the United States, and Europe lags because of the lack of that. I personally think, and that's the reason why I think this is also something that really needs to be led by industry, that the fate of the European economy in the future is also linked to the extent to which we can implement or we can make progress in this path towards greater assets, capabilities that are built and housed in Europe for growth, not just for resilience, but for growth. There are views that are not necessarily aligned with this. So Paul Krugman, who is, of course, a Nobel Prize, has written recently a Substack in which he says, Europeans are also worried about the being behind in tech. But really, when you look at standards of living, yes, when you have a really active tech sector like the Silicon Valley, the productivity growth in the west of the United States is higher than everywhere else, but quality of life, standards of living are not very different. So Europe, even if it doesn't have a Silicon Valley, can certainly have standards of living that are equivalent and doesn't need to bother itself other than for the security issue. How do you see the link between this call, this awakening to the need to do more digital work in Europe, digital assets in Europe, and a broader predicament, the fact that the economy is, of course, as Draghi described, in a difficult particular situation at the moment. Do you want to comment on this respectively? Maybe Rafael, you start.
I read this piece as well, and I felt so much better after this until I realized, well, maybe it's not true. Well, it's soothing my European soul in a way. We're not that bad after all. That's something you really like to hear. And I agree in some part that I think we have a much better cultural foundation in Europe than many of these other regions have. I like being a European. And I think we're very attractive for people because we do things that others don't. And I think the numbers don't speak to the quality of what we have. And Paul, I think, is right in that. I think what he gets wrong is that everything digital is an enabling technology for creating wealth. And we will better do, because otherwise our back garden, as beautiful as it might be, will turn into an industrial museum with very poor people that run the museum for the Chinese and Americans to come by and see, look, this is where it all started. Wonderful. But we're sort of a poor Disneyland after that. So no, I mean, I disagree with us just being complacent because it's all great. Obviously not. It's still great. That's the good news, right? Where we're still okay, but we're sort of on a trajectory that's not great. All this wealth was created in Germany and Europe in the mid 1850s, 70s. when technology was industrialized first in England, right, and then scaled in Germany because the Prussians were creating Germany in 1871, and they knew how to scale things. So chaos created innovation, and order scaled it. That's the dichotomy that you need, which is hard to keep up. And we've seen 3 Nobel Prizes of people that were sort of researching that, which is fantastic. And I leave it to Dietmar to comment on that, because he could have gotten the Nobel Prize in my mind for that. He's thinking about these things so long. No, we lived 150 years quite well from that perfect system. Made in Germany was created at the time, right? Because we were just making and scaling, and the automobile industry, pharma industry, chemical industries, machinery, everything was created at the time and created wealth for all the time, even with wars in between, everything destroyed. Here we are. The next industrial revolution is just now starting. We're at an inflection point. And we all know that, right? We know that digital technology, including AI, now finally completely changes the world in every industry. And now we have to sort of just look back 150 years, steam engines. Okay, we optimize steam engines, we create generators, we create power for everyone, we create power lines. Now we can build factories and so forth. That is going on in the virtual realm now. This is what we're seeing. And this will be changing everything. Now, if you don't build the foundations of that industry, you're not building the subsequent industries either. So that's what it's all about. So, no, we can't be complacent. Great place, good opportunity. We've done it before, but we've got to do it again.
We've got to do it again. Dietmar, this is your specialty subject. And indeed, I'm awaiting news of your Nobel Prize next time. But no, most seriously, this is, of course, as somebody who has studied innovation all your life, I think that the question really remains, we cannot really sort of think, as Krugman suggests, that, well, it doesn't matter if we don't have the kind of capacities over here. In the end, it all kind of evens out, right?
That is right. And it's very interesting that I think what he overlooks is what we as Europeans have overlooked for a long, long time. So let me start with the European false perception or incorrect perception, which is that as long as there's division of labor and we do our machine tools and our chemicals and our cars and so forth, the others can have digital. And we will still be able to trade and so forth. And they overlook what Rafael has already pointed out, that digital is potentially a choke point because it can control the rest, right? If you don't have digital for cars, if you don't have digital for the machine tools and so forth, you have almost nothing because the machine tools have become commoditized. China has learned great deals from the German machine tool makers and the Swiss machine tool makers and is producing now competitive machinery. Now, the competition has moved into the digital domain. That is also where the spillover effects happen into other sectors, where we have been talking about digital as a general purpose technology for a long time now. And we are talking now about AI as the general purpose technology of potentially of this century. And I think those are big words, but they are potentially right. I think that is not included in Paul's analysis, and it should be included. So we have to move into, maybe with some specialization, the coupling of industrial data and AI, the coupling of industrial processes and digital, but we have to become better in digital technology. And we missed the boat on that. And I can go into that because digital has been a missing element in engineering culture in France, in Germany, but also in other countries in continental Europe. And we need to pick that up. Let me just conclude with one point. The little diatribe that Paul has contributed reminded me of his comments on Airbus, which he gave in the 1980s and 1990s when he tried to talk Europeans out of Airbus. And right now, I think Airbus is a wonderful contribution that Europe provides to the United States in terms of resilience, just in case that that Boeing doesn't do a good job at certain times.
Wonderful way. I want to stay with you because indeed what you touched upon, particularly towards the end, goes directly to the next thing I wanted to discuss. Of course, before we discuss the future, we really need to, it's useful at least to understand how we got here. Okay, so you mentioned there the lack of engineering culture, perhaps in France and Germany on digital when doing education. More broadly, we know what the diagnosis is. There is quite a lot of reasoning and analysis of why we got here. So the number one culprit is, of course, because you need to scale. Europe is a fragmented continent. Scaling is difficult. There are these barriers. At the same time, you see hyperscalers rolling across Europe, right? I remember being there when Amazon started in 2005, and they started at headquarters in Germany, and then the instructions from Seattle was just roll out. They went to the UK, they went to France, they went to Italy, they went to Spain. It doesn't seem, let's just not kid ourselves, that was a particularly great barrier. And then, of course, there is the funding, the lack of capital market. All of this is true. But I'd like you to just elaborate on the back of your initial comment of a lack of culture, perhaps, of course, also lack of capacity at the state level to do anything very useful in this space. I heard you before, Dietmar, lamenting the competencies of our bureaucracy in this space. And while nobody relies completely on the bureaucracy and the state to move, to map the future, it is a question of capacity and competences there. Do you want to give us more on that?
Sure. Let me start with your argument that apparently the Microsofts of this world can deal with European fragmentation so easily. And you're right in your assessment. But they all had starting conditions in Silicon Valley in a 300 million customers market in the United States with a reasonably unified capital market, huge financing opportunities and so forth. And that is what our startups at this point do not have. So fragmentation of the European market, the sort of state of our capital markets, which are not deep enough, I think is really worrisome, and we need to work on that. So I really welcome Mario Draghi's and Manuel Heiter's thoughts on 28th regime, possibility of creating one legal form for startup firms in Europe so that they don't have to incorporate in, let's say, 4 or 5 European countries to come close to 200 million customers, potential customers, right? So I think we need to really look at that. The second point you asked for the possibilities of that states have, and I think we have missed the boat on public sector procurement completely. And the United States has, one, been able to use that, and second, to hide it from the sight of our fellow economists who think that everything's done by the market in the United States. No, there's very smart procurement policies in Department of Defense, but also Department of Energy and so forth. And they partly feed startups and allow them to grow, right, by giving them procurement contracts rather than giving them subsidies. And I think we need to move away from the subsidization philosophy that we have in Europe to a philosophy of enabling private markets to come in and enabling the public sector to use smart procurement. Now, the culture point, engineering culture point, is probably the trickiest. So Rafael pointed to the Prussian state. Engineering in Germany only came about around the 1890s. Technical universities were only created in the 1890s. The diploma in engineering, which became a world-famous degree, only came out in the 1890s, okay? And that gave us an advantage because in continental Europe, by the way, in France, very similar developments. In continental Europe, the ingenieur was linked to ingenium, genius. The engineer in Britain was the guy on the engine shoveling coal into the machine with a coal-smeared face. No reputational advantage there, okay? So these things help to bring a profession forward, and they give solid support for technical activity, for technology in a society. Now, where we missed the boat was really to bring digital into this culture, to bring these cultures together and to enable our engineers to be as good in coding as they were in Silicon Valley where the computer science guys were right next to electrical engineers, while we packed them in Germany with the mathematics folks, and they did abstract computer science. So that is an innuendo. I apologize for that. We have very, very smart people. But I think what we need to realize is that we have to bring digital, coding, computer science, AI into all realms of education in Europe. And that will enable us to be much better at bringing ideas to the core. Then we still have the scaling problem, but for that, I gave you two arguments before.
Great. Let me just pursue this with Rafael. So one, lots of things Dietmar said. Procurement is, of course, something that we all kind of focus on. Because as Dietmar alluded to, the paradox of Europe is that while everywhere else in the US you have Buy American, in Korea you have Buy Korean, China I don't even need to mention. In Europe, the default is buy from everywhere. Why? Because we are fair. We are fair and we don't want to discriminate. And of course, originally the idea might have been that you don't want the Germans only to buy from Germany or French only to buy from France. But this is now being weaponized against us by outsiders saying, oh, you want to discriminate against us. That's anti-competitive. That's bad. So procurement is something I'd like you to comment on specifically, Rafael. And the next thing is, of course, again, your main specialist subject. You run what is, as I mentioned at the beginning, a model agency. We've been a little mean to the capacity of the government so far, but your agency is the evidence that things can be done in a smart, effective, and fast way. It's an exception, I have to say, and I know that your model is being looked at and copied elsewhere. So do you want to just take us meandering through these 2 points? Procurement, how do you see it? And then how did you think about, I'm not asking you to give us the story of Sprint, but your insights as to what can be done smartly? Because otherwise, the reality, and I conclude, is that in my experience, we are in a world in which European business have been somewhat infantilized by the belief that somehow someone, a Deus ex machina, the European Commission, DG Connect, should do something. But then you said, but what can they do and how can they have the vision to map the digital industry of the future? It's impossible. So please let me just be quiet and give you the opportunity to comment on all of this.
Well, you're talking a very broad point, because I think the result of the complacent culture we've given ourselves in the past maybe 30 years, 40 years. We didn't need to spend money on defense because the Americans were protecting us. Right? They were spending, I don't know, 700 billion every year for the DoD. And they were the big boys in NATO, and we were making ourselves comfortable. And since we didn't spend that money on that, we could spend it on social welfare and many other things, which is great in a way. This is maybe also why Europe feels so comfortable to Paul. But on the other hand, we did not push forward what created this wealth to begin with. And that's everywhere. It's in industry. It's in science, as Dietmar mentioned. We kind of lost this wonderful engineering culture, with the engineers, and software engineers account for nothing in Europe. We pay them very poorly. We look down at them. I'm a software engineer. I know what I'm talking about. In the US, they get salaries of millions a year because they're highly valued and people know what kind of difference they can make. We still think that you can build software, you build a machine factory. Like when VW said, oh, we need more software, they hired 20,000 lowly paid software engineers and thought this would solve the problem. Well, guess what? It didn't. It's a surprise. It didn't work. We're at a wake up. Governments. Of course, governments evolved that way. When you look at the government quota of the BPI in Germany, it's been going up. And whilst the industry is now sort of flattening out, the government participation is still going up. And many people in government think that we just continue the way we've done before. I guess the way to describe this in a more abstract way is that we've created closed systems: industry, government, and science. We've locked the doors. We've created incentives for the people to stay inside the systems. So when you're in science, it's publish, H-index, Google Scholar, and these kinds of things, and a career to become eventually a professor who's a state employee for all his life with a nice pension at the very end, right, Dietmar? And it's very hard to break out of this system because you're losing so much. So you're even being looked down upon, because if a science person founds a company and suddenly becomes rich, he's not highly regarded at all, right? He's expelled from the system, and he's looked down upon. And it's not a career path that we teach our children, that we teach our students, that you might want to break out of the system. Luckily, some still do it because they're the crazy ones, and we always needed them, but it's just not enough. You by a factor of 10. If you look into government, same thing. Right? I mean, Bavaria at least sends government employees for 2 years to the outside, to the industry, and then they come back, and then they can become a Beamter. And they all go like, okay, I got to do this for 2 years, but then I'm coming back, and then I have my pension secured when I'm 35. That's the life goal. And you're in the system. And of course, you're protecting your system. And guess what? The number of Beamten, life government employees, is increasing. The liability of their pensions is increasing. We have no system. Now you go to the industry, same thing. It's rare that industry people change systems. But it also from industry to stay government. And I'm one of the very few exceptions. I don't know how many pre-industry people we have in government, maybe 5 or so. It's not more than of thousands. Right? That we don't have that. If you look back at the good old times, that was much easier. We were producing PhDs, if required, in 2 years, and for them to be able to work on the stuff we really need. Okay, let's not expect them for half a decade, to do their PhDs. Let's have them do something, right? And the prof was just stamping the PhDs for them to go out, and that created this whole slew of German scientists, for example, but it was pretty similar in France, that then went into industry and created stuff. Right? This explosion of stuff, of technology, was what happened between the 1870s and 1930s, right? where we're doing very well. So we need to change, we need to break up the silo. Right? We need to make it possible for profs to found companies, to work on these companies, take their PhDs and their intellectual property easily with them into their startups. We have to make sure that these startups get well funded. We have to make sure that the industry realizes that they're stuck in an innovator's dilemma. And the only way of breaking out of this is to work with a startup ecosystem. I'm always suggesting to the industry that instead of having an innovation manager in their company or something, or having a corporate venture fund, they should much rather invest into many venture funds, which would provide more money to the venture funds, which is an investment for them. It's not money spent, that's money invested. If they invest enough, it will come back with a little extra, most likely. And look at the pipeline of startups that they're interested in. And support the ones that they find interesting. Maybe put another check on top of them with more money if they like what they see. Open their distribution channels and their networks and their ability to scale products to them. And if they really like what they see, they should eventually buy that company or take it public. Right? Whenever we build these champions in Europe, they get acquired by US companies or Chinese companies. 80% of the large exits are going outside. This is wild, right? Because that's the innovation that the industry needs. So break up these silos, work with the ecosystem, make it align, create alignment of interest. And of course, government needs to make sure to walk away from the old tools that are not working anymore. They're way too slow. So when, for example, a government decides they want to fund nuclear fusion or quantum computers or AI, they set up a program and they discuss top down what it needs to be. And then 2 years later, the program comes out and people need to apply with 450 pages of explanation what they're going to do in the next 3 or 5 years and pencil they're going to buy in the end. And then we put the burden of controlling on them on micromanagement. Again, then they have to explain when they bought this pencil, how much it was, why they needed it, and we're bogging them down. Many profs are saying it takes 80% of their time to deal with the government funding of their science. That's wild. That's crazy. There are other tools that we've shown at Sprint. What these are, we do challenges. The time to money at challenges is 14 days from application to money on the bank account. And even with individual project funding, it's no more than 3 months. And we take it down. We're working hard on taking it down. What Draghi was requesting also from the European institutions like EIC or ERC become much quicker. And it's not happening at a pace it should. Right? And in Germany, it's not happening at a pace it should. But I think to get into do mode, that's exactly where most of the value sits. At the very end is innovative procurement. I mean, that's what the US does very well. I mean, Tesla wouldn't exist, SpaceX wouldn't exist, Silicon Valley wouldn't exist without this tool. And it's billion-dollar contracts, right, that are given out in competition so that many can participate. We need to use these modern tool challenges. Time to money needs to be KPI, innovative procurement to fund the ecosystem that I just described.
Wonderful. So, Dietmar, I want you to develop this point. We are in the final segment. We are talking about what this European sovereignty resurgence, the conversation that is everywhere, what can it consist of realistically? We don't care for more conferences and more chats and more workshops. As Rafael says, the emphasis should be on the do, and his agency is a model in this respect. What do you see as promising and credible in the current conversation, and where would you like the effort to absolutely be focused on, not to waste more time?
Yeah, I think not wasting more time, Rafael alluded to that already, is absolutely crucial, absolutely essential here. We cannot afford the slow processes, the encrusted structures, incentives, and so forth, under which very smart people in government are working. We need new processes. So my sort of call to the new German government was, folks, what gives us for chutzpah, the courage to say that by tossing a little bit more money into the same processes and bureaucratic procedures that we have known not to work for 20 years now will perform better in this legislature? They will not. We need to change how we do things. And Rafael is showing with his organization that speed is possible, that competition is not sort of something that you need to neglect if you want to be fast. No, you can do both. And you can build smart ecosystems from these technology challenges, for example, that he's using. And I think that, first of all, governments can learn from these tools, from these processes. We need to be more output, results oriented in what we do. It shouldn't be enough to tick the box that the process was adhered to. We should ask from our government that they have results. And that is completely anathema in many areas, both at the Brussels level and, if I'm now looking at Germany, in Germany. And we need to get away from that. Fortunately, the pressure is mounting and it pushes us in the right direction. But there is, of course, always also counter pushing to these positions. So, from my perspective, we need to look at how government does its business. We need to be pragmatic and not sort of ideological, guided by some theory of Econ 101, what the government may do or may not do. We need to bring technocrats from industry into government, and we need to make that possible. Certain structures in Germany, for example, make it awfully hard to bring somebody from industry into government, but that is the know-how that we need in order to run processes, procurement, technology development, R&D programs, and so forth, effectively and in an agile way. So it comes back to sort of breaking up the silos and including people from the other sectors, having these interchanges that the Bavarian government fortunately has, and where it brings things in. We need much more of that, and we need speed.
We need that, but do you, I don't want to use the word confident, but even hopeful. How hopeful are you that things are moving in that direction? Because we enthusiastically agree amongst ourselves that this is really what's needed. And yet, I honestly do not know. This is why I'm putting so much hope into the private sector, and I hope that they will wake up and be taking initiative, because even though we agree that this is what needs to happen, it doesn't yet seem to happen. Rafael is an exception, a person from business into government. I was reading about, and I think, Rafael, you were there, maybe you were the exception. And this is not a criticism, but a commission that was created by the German government to discuss AI. And it was all law professors and researchers and such deserving people. But my impression was, where is the industry muscle in that discussion? These are all very worthy individual, intellectuals and so on, but it's not industry. Brussels is even worse, of course. We know that they work in their own ivory tower and they come up with ideas like AI factories and so on that people don't necessarily recognize. So we agree, and yet there is this big disconnect that I do not know how to kind of bridge. Plus, there is the discussion at the level of member states, which is very different. France is in a different place from Germany. My impression is that, of course, France ideologically has been in favor of sovereignty for much longer. Germany is getting there, but with much more caution. Then where are the Italians missing in action? Then where are the Dutch? Where is Northern Europe? I mean, this is all a very patchy landscape. So how hopeful can we be? And I don't want to end on a negative note. I want us to be optimistic, because I personally feel very frustrated by being told always that Europe is too late at X. Okay? So Europe is late at chips. Europe is too late at this. I refuse to accept that logic. But on the other hand, we need to stare reality in the face. I don't see that governments are moving in the direction you two are necessarily sketching. Do you want to comment on that? Maybe try and prove me wrong and tell me this is all kind of going to go better. Rafael, you want to start?
Well, I leave some to Dietmar because I think I know what he's going to say. But I gave a T-shirt to Chancellor Merz 2 weeks ago, which says pessimism is a waste of time. That's our slogan, because he was using the same words. He said, we have no time for pessimism. We need more trust and do instead of control and micromanagement. So I'm hearing from our chancellor in Germany the right spirit is going into the right direction. Just 2 days ago, I was at the launch of what's called the high-tech agenda for Germany, which has 6 big technology topics, one of them being clean energy infusion, which we like, quantum computers, microcomputers, sciences. And it stated goals for all of these, that, for example, we want a fusion power plant in Germany at the end of this. So clear KPIs, do mode, right? Milestone-based programs, working through startups, funding the startups with enough money so that they can get there. It's all the right words, I think, in there. So something is indeed changing, at least in the words. I think now I can say with in all honesty that I believe that the government has realized that we have to switch to do mode and that we have to do things differently. We cannot continue doing the same things all over again and hoping for a change. That's insane. That's not going to happen. And I think that realization is in the heads of the leading people in government. All the ministers that I talk to, it's all in their heads. There's also a willingness to change. Now, the judgment is still out on the do side, because this is where it becomes really difficult, because the apparatus underneath is used to the old tools and finds the new tools pretty wild. They all find Sprint pretty wild. We're still the crazy ones. We're sort of alien still. Although, that France has approached us, and now myself and the CEO of BPI are building a commission for building a French version of Sprint. Same for the Netherlands. We're working with Vinnova in Sweden, where we've been, we signed an MOU. We will do mutual challenges. We're even doing a mutual challenge with the National Science NSF, National Science Foundation, in the US. And hopefully somebody from Italy eventually calls as well. So we're spreading the way we work. There's lots of reason for hope. Of course, it's still very small little plants that we're seeing that have to grow much bigger. And we'll see in the next 3 years if this really happens. And we were talking to the EIC, EIB, ERC a lot. Commissioner Zarayeva was at this conference in Germany that I mentioned before, and she was using the same words. So in a way, if I want to make it very simple, we have to turn that realization and willingness into action. And there is reason to hope that we actually do this well, and then things will change.
Over to you, Dietmar.
Well, we don't use chainsaws in Europe to do what Rafael just asked for, right? So the long, the short of what he said was, hey, we now have the awareness, we've done the analysis, everybody sees that it can work, see Sprint, but also see smaller countries in Europe like Switzerland, the Scandinavian countries, who have been much more agile than the big France, Germany, Italy, and so forth for a while. They have had better government processes, shorter decision-making times, and so forth. So it is all there. But we have to rattle the cages of bureaucrats and government officials who, as Rafael just pointed out, are in the mode of doing the same thing all over and all over again and haven't realized that the house is on fire, right? Our competitiveness is threatened. And at some point, we will not have the tax income anymore to finance science, social security, or military security. We really have to get going now. So the urgency, I think, has been perceived in most leadership circles. It has to come down now to the organizations. And as I said, we may have to rattle them, and we may have to break out activities into agency-like organizations like Sprint, enable them to be fast and agile, free them from unnecessary red tape, and just let them do their thing.
Wonderful. We are at the end. Rattling the cages is something I very much feel totally empathetic with. I'm often told that I'm somewhat provocative, but I totally love that expression. Let me just ask you a final comment to both of you. Of course, we are in the very run-up to the Digital Summit, which is a French and German initiative. Everyone appears to be converging on Berlin on the 18th. Do we feel that that is going to be another talk shop, or does it, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but do we expect this putting it on the map so explicitly to actually help progress and rattle the cages to some extent, or is it going to be a dog and pony show? Maybe you first, Dietmar, and then we wrap up with Rafael.
Well, I guess it all depends how the speakers are primed. And it's not just the speakers, right? It's the wrapping and the staging of the whole thing. I'm very happy that we have this event. And I think if we convey the spirit of rattling cages, I like the metaphor a lot, as you know, and sort of breaking up encrusted structures and letting smart people who are in all these organizations, right? We don't have dumb people in our public sector, but we need to entitle them, to enable them to do their thing and to go forward. And of course, we also need to bring in the industrial, the technical, the technocratic know-how aside of cutting the red tape. And I'm very hopeful. You asked about optimism versus pessimism. I'm with Rafael on this. We don't have time for pessimism. And if you go to his technology challenges, the pitches, if you go to a hackathon here in Munich, we just had one three weeks ago on agentic systems and stuff like that. There's so much energy. It's because of this energy that OpenAI comes and opens offices here. But we need to sort of use that energy for European welfare and not for sort of supporting the gatekeepers and other monopolists from other places.
Great. Rafael, actually, to conclude, part of this process, and, Dietmar mentioned it, and it just made me want to bring it out. In this journey towards greater European resilience and independence, what we are also seeing is that companies themselves, large companies particularly, are very reluctant to cooperate in this effort to move to European alternatives. Do you think that we talked a lot about government capacity, rattling the cages, the bureaucracy and so on, but there is also, as a final question, an industrial dimension, and companies are safe and they are risk averse and don't want to just shift their compute load into something which is, but that is this kind of switching cost, this kind of concern is a major obstacle that I can see to people making different choices. Do you think that we are on the way to creating? My perception is we are, but more appetite for experimenting with European assets, or maybe still a long way off?
Well, half, I would say. I in the past years, I've been pushing a lot for these sovereignty choke points, but industry wasn't very interested. I remember sitting at a dinner with then Chancellor Scholz about 5G sovereignty, Huawei, and so forth. And guess what? The international companies that we have, like Deutsche Telekom or SAP or so, don't care because they're global companies anyway.
Exactly.
Right? And there is no, to them, the CEO of SAP said he doesn't get this whole digital sovereignty discussion. We have sovereignty because we have AWS and Azure. And you can imagine what my blood pressure was like when he said this. But things are changing as they realize that they will fall victim to these choke points themselves. And so now we see that interest in, for example, the AI gigafactories. Think of them what you want, but at least there is some real interest in participating in creating some sovereignty, also into integrating deeper into the technology stack and getting some control over their fate. The very simple example, of course, is companies that need batteries from China and they don't get them anymore. And so you're not building a product anymore. So this is really starting to hurt. So they feel the choke points. So that increases the willingness to change and actually invest into sovereignty, which they weren't there before. I think they're getting there because they're feeling the pain. And this is how it works. This is how we human beings are, right? We don't care about our health until it hurts, right? It may be too late. We should care a little earlier and think a little more forward. I think that has changed. But that adds to my hope that things are actually changing because they have to and they will move as well.
Wonderful. I've taken a lot of your time. I know you're both busy. I just want to thank you for this conversation that to me was super interesting and touched on every one of the things I think are relevant and salient in this moment. We will see what happens in Berlin in the coming days. Meantime, I'm sure listeners will enjoy this as much as I have. Thank you both again for making time for this, and best of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, Christina.